Vegeta, what does the scouter say about his power level?
It's over 9.
There's no way that can be right.
Power level is a topic that is often discussed in EDH circles. From deck construction to pregame talk, it is one of the most frequently occurring topics in the entire EDH community. There is a reason for this, of course. Power level is one of the unique pillars of EDH that separates it from tournament formats like Standard or Legacy. When I sit down with someone to play Standard, I go right to trying to win. When I sit down to play EDH, I first ask, so what power level are we playing at? There are important gameplay and game pacing related distinctions that are marked by our deck's given power level. A casual soldier tribal deck will likely stand no chance against a competitive EDH level fast combo deck. A bear deck, containing every single card ever printed with bears on the art, will probably get crushed by a well-tuned Ayula deck. In order to avoid games that produce bad feels or one-sided outcomes, power level is used to ensure that no one deck is using cards or strategies that are more powerful than the others. On paper, it seems like a good idea. The system should make sure that games remain as balanced and fun as possible. However, the system often falls apart in practice. How's it going, everybody? My name's Josh from Elder Drunken Highlander, and this is our video on the power level ranking systems that are used in EDH, where we discuss the pros and cons of many of them, and talk about the one that we use for our own deck techs here at the end. How do we gauge power level? There are a few different methods. The most common one as of now is a simple 1 through 10 scale. The idea behind this method is that a 1 represents a random pile of crap, and a 10 represents the best possible deck. In theory, this is a great system. It is simple, granular enough, and easy to remember and explain. However, it doesn't accurately illustrate what the middle of the spectrum looks like, and one will notice that different playgroups can have vastly different ideas of an average power deck. In addition to being different from playgroup to playgroup, this system doesn't accurately explain what an average deck looks like. Is it an EDH Precon? A certain budget deck? The stock list for the most popular commander on EDH Rec? There is no baseline to compare anything in the middle to. The last issue isn't one with the system itself. Most players don't want to be 5. However, for the system to work properly, most decks would fall in the 4 to 6 power scale. That would be the average power level of a deck. This, however, is not the case if you ask most people. In fact, most people say their deck is a 7. 7 is 2 above the median, so realistically, most decks would not be at 7. If the argument can be made that decks that are at a 7 are of the focused power level, and that is a level that most players can build decks at, then wouldn't most decks be at a 7? This makes for even less granularity at the top than there already was. If 7 is the median or average power deck, then the difference between an 8 and a 9 is immense. Are all competitive EDH decks lumped in at 10? Very rarely, because of this, do people say their deck is a 6 or lower, so essentially, we are working with 3 or 4 numbers when using this scale. That is less than ideal when EDH decks can span a myriad of power levels. The culture around saying one's power level is a 7 is so pervasive that even though this system is arguably the most accurate, widely used method of power level evaluation, there are many who advocate for abandoning it entirely. Another widely used method is simply asking, what turn does your deck establish a win by? This doesn't just mean comboing out, but essentially establishing a reasonable lock for control decks and hitting critical mass for aggro and mid-range decks. This is also a relatively accurate method, but it has 2 major issues. The first is that many deck archetypes intentionally try to slow down the game before establishing a lock or combo. A competitive EDH deck, such as Niv Mizzet Parent, for example, wants to cast Interaction for the first 5 or so turns before trying to win, but it would still remain on the same power level as decks that can win turn 2 and turn 3 with a degree of regularity. Another issue is that less experienced players may not know when their deck threatens a win, or don't goldfish or practice on their own to get an idea. The last reason is archetypes such as I Play Your Spells, Group Hug, or Chaos don't have standard turn clocks, as they rely on chance or other players. The final commonly employed method that we will discuss in this video is tier lists. These lists certainly serve a purpose for online play, for which many of them are designed, but they are based by design on commanders themselves and not the decks they helm. Take the tier list used by the Play EDH Discord, for example. This list is maintained by one of the largest online Magic communities out there, and its tier list is used to facilitate games based on power level. While it certainly functions ideally for the limited scope of what it's supposed to do, it focuses mostly on the average capability of each commander and not in any way the often unique decks that are built around them. This could make it very easy to misrepresent a deck's power level. As an example, I could take a competitive EDH deck such as Varol's Hulk and swap the commander from Varol's to Jared, Golgari Lichlord. The deck would be 1 or 2 turns slower, but ultimately the same. According to this tier list, my deck would only be a mid-power commander, but I would still average wins around turns 3 to 5. Another not so much flaw, but issue I have with not just this list in particular, but many methods, is that it stops listing commanders at casual. There's no acknowledgement of the bottom of the scale. Well, again, I get that this particular method was created for the purpose of moderating online play. Many other lists and ranking systems also ignore the bottom of the scale. The 1 to 10 method may as well be a 5 to 10 method, because I very rarely hear people call their decks a 4. This isn't really a bad thing. There should be as few or even less 1-power decks than there are 10s, but if the scale actually starts at 5, it is no wonder people think a 7 is average. The last thing I want to touch upon before I start to get into the ranking system we use for our decks and our deck techs is the stigma around decks being casual. I think where people get mixed up is they think casual decks can't be focused or optimized. Casual shouldn't mean your deck is suboptimal or bad. It should mean your deck building and play decisions don't necessarily try to win as efficiently as possible. Whether this is through deck building constraints or lack of card pool is irrelevant. The majority of decks that I build and play sit nicely in what I would call the casual or tuned casual range, and that is something I aim for intentionally and shouldn't be ashamed of. We'll get more into what I think makes a deck casual later, but it definitely doesn't mean the deck is bad. For this channel, we have created a power level ranking system to use in our deck techs that is an amalgamation of aspects from some of the previous systems. This system is based heavily on the 1 to 10 system that the majority of players know and understand, while ditching the numbers in favor of names that offer a more clear explanation of what each level means. This will also, hopefully, keep players who choose to use this as well from unconsciously choosing the 7 out of 10 option for their decks just because they don't want to admit that they built something that is average power level, or because they don't want to give away how strong their deck really is. As the name of this video indicates, your deck probably isn't a 7. Despite this, we understand that most people will still unconsciously label their deck as at least above average, just because that's how people are, so we decided to sacrifice some granularity at the top of the scale and placed casual at the 5 mark. That way, most decks will be at or above the middle of the line. While this means the bottom of the scale will go largely unused like it does in many other rating systems, it will also hopefully allow for more accurate self-reporting of power levels. Now, without any further deliberation, let's explain each tier. For each tier, I will give lists of example commanders and strategies that you might see at these power levels. Remember that just because a commander is used for an example of one tier doesn't mean that all decks with it would be at that level. I could helm a blue-black consultation control deck with Savitri Skarzam and it could probably still make high power. Pile of garbage. This tier consists of decks with no synergies at all. Not all decks here are garbage. Fantastic janks such as Goat Tribal and true proper EDH with a common legendary would be at this level. Some common decks you may see at this level are Savitri Skarzam Pauper Voltron, Isan's Shade Homeland's Theme Deck, Tivadar of Thorn, White Weenie, or a personal favorite of mine, every single card with a bear on the art in a pile with some basic lands. Built from Draft Shaft. This tier is for decks from people who are trying to build and play on their own but may not yet have the card pool. In my opinion, this tier most accurately captures the original spirit of Commander, where you'll see decks made from what people just had lying around with the cards they thought would be fun. You know someone's deck is at this level when you ask them why they chose their commander and they respond, it's what I had. Decks like this can be a lot of fun to make and play with friends. Some common decks you may see at this level are Ith, High Arcanist Control, a tribal deck with a random commander chosen just for colors, a deck of mostly commons and uncommons built around a Dominaria or dual deck legend, or something like Kamal Pitfighter, Big Red. Bad Precon. This tier is pretty self-explanatory. The pre-constructed EDH decks are a great baseline to compare your own builds to. Most players build decks that are at least as strong as these ones, and so they are rather ideal for the purposes of comparison. While they do function well as decks on their own, some are better than others. Player-made decks at these levels are often starting to be focused but still developing their card pools, usually because they just don't have the cards yet. This is the level that a lot of people's first homebrew decks are created at. Some of the precons we had in mind when creating this tier are the Anji precon from Commander 2019 or the Riku precon from Commander 2011. Good precon. Let me just start this off by saying there's no ugly precon category. With that out of the way, this category is for decks that are still lacking in focus like the previous category, but pack more of a punch. Player-made decks at this level are often unoptimized decks built around individually powerful commanders, such as Avacyn Angel of Hope with very few board wipes or ramp pieces, or a Yuriko deck with a lot of bad, high CMC cards they will never cast. Some of the precons we had in mind when naming this tier were the Freyalise precon from Commander 2014 or the Edgar Markov precon from the Commander 2017. Casual. Alright, now we're into the real ranking system, since I know none of y'all are ever going to admit your deck is just as good as or worse than a precon anyways. Casual decks aren't necessarily focused, but they have a game plan and a way to execute it. They usually are built with achieving a specific game state in mind, and contain mana ramp, card advantage, and a little bit of disruption to get them to that point. A casual deck isn't trying to win as fast as possible, but instead let other people play out their decks a little before trying to overcome them with some kind of path to victory. The casual level is where most decks reside. That means a few, if not almost half of your decks, fewer, are casual, as are mine. Some decks you may commonly see at this level are Lavisa Cold Eyes Creature Aggro, Phoenix Mill, Guafa Hazid Prison Hug, Multani Yavamaya's Avatar Lands Matter, or Lorthos Sea Monsters. Again, I'd like to reiterate, a deck being casual doesn't mean it's bad, or even below average. It just means it would crush Goblins Dying in the Art Tribal, and get crushed by Urza Powered Scepter. Tuned Casual. This is for more casual decks with a more efficient plan. You will see a lot of the same cards in this tier, but these decks operate using inherently more powerful strategies or commanders. For example, while Multani Lands Matter would be casual, a similar deck helmed by Mina and Den would fall under Tuned Casual. Tuned Casual decks generally are more consistent and have more concrete win conditions than a casual deck. An example of a concrete win condition would be adding Beastmaster Ascension to a token deck as a way to push through with critical mass, instead of just spamming in more ways to make tokens. Some decks commonly seen in the Tuned Casual category are Evra Voltron, Shovel Bane of Monsters Creature Control, Gisa and Geralf Zombie Tribal, or Kyanos and Tiro of Miletus Group Hug Labman. High Power. These are decks that are starting to be built with the intent to win. They are focused, with cards chosen for synergy and individual strength rather than flavor or personal attachment factors. High-power decks are usually piloted by players who know them well and built them with the intention of executing a similar strategy each game. As such, they are generally consistent and carry enough card advantage and removal not only to take themselves to their desired win state, but to also disrupt other high-powered decks. Once decks reach this level, players begin to run a lot more board wipes, counterspells, and artifact and enchantment removal than you would normally see at the casual or tuned casual level. Some decks often found at the high power level include Rakdos, Lord of Riots Eldrazi, Zozu Stacks, the Scarab God Control, Simic Good Stuff, or the classic Atraxa Super Friends. Tuned High Power. These are high-powered decks that are either on inherently strong strategies or tuned to the absolute utmost of what a non-competitive commander can do. These decks have a well thought out and focused game plan, and will attempt to execute it consistently in almost every game. Tuned high power decks can sometimes be just as pub stompy as competitive EDH decks when played against lower powered pods, and are often specifically tuned to play against existing popular high power strategies. This means they often pack more cheap removal than casual decks, as well as ways to execute their game plan faster. This level is where you start to see decks with very low converted mana costs. Some decks you may commonly see in the tuned high power category are Nekuzar Wheels, Krenko Mob Boss, Golos Lands, or Golos Turns, or Golos Good Stuff, or why is it so easy to break Golos? Also, 3 or more color artifact combo piles could be common. Fringe CEDH. These are competitive EDH decks that are good enough but not quite top tier. There's not much to explain about this tier, except that to a casual level deck, there's essentially no difference between this tier and the ones above and below it in terms of how unfair the matchup is. Some decks that could be considered fringe CEDH are Smothering Arbiter, Mizzix Storm, Mad Farm, and Flibblethip. CEDH. This is it, the cream of the crop, the best of the best, the #1 decks in the meta. This tier should require no explanation. No compromises are made in terms of win potential. Some examples of the top decks right now are Consultation Kess, the First Sliver Food Chain, Thrasios and Timna Scepter, Godo, Bandit Warlord, the Gitrog Monster, Kinnan, and Sylvala Brostorm. These CEDH decks all seek to win as quickly as possible, or at least prevent their opponents from doing so, and interact on entirely different axes than most casual, tuned casual, or even high power decks. So these are all the levels of our power ranking system and why we think it is worth using with your playgroup and even strangers at your LGS. The idea behind it, again, is to more accurately group decks by getting around poor self-reporting due to either intentional or unconscious player bias and lack of knowledge about the capabilities of one's own deck. By using named tiers instead of numbers, we can get around the stigma of everyone's deck being a so-called 7, while still relying on a 1 to 10 scale that many people are familiar with. One last little footnote. Player skill, while not a factor in determining power level, should be taken into account when selecting decks. If you, as an experienced player, are in a pod with 3 people who are still learning, you might find more balanced games if you select a deck at a lower power level. The same is sometimes also true for the inverse. So what do you think? Is this power rating system helpful? Will it work? How would you suggest improving it? Maybe if we get enough suggestions, we can roll them into a second video. Also, lastly, let us know how you would rank your own personal decks within our system. We are curious to know where people will place themselves and their builds. Thank you so much for watching, and if you could share with your friends, like and subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. See you next time.